Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about arguments. The reason to discuss arguments is just that we see arguments all the time. We see whenever we are trying to persuade someone or someone's trying to persuade us, or whenever we are reading something, either an essay or newsletter, maybe a paper, an academic paper, a scientific paper, all of those contain arguments. Uh, and arguments are just when you see these in newspapers or in essays, they are usually just some reasons that the author offers in support of his views or her views. But we're going to be looking at arguments from a more technical standpoint. So we're going to examine what makes an argument a good argument, what's the structure, the logical structure of arguments, what does it mean what does it mean that an argument is good, what does it mean that the premises of the argument support its conclusion. So we're going to be looking at some of that, and we're going to say a little bit about the connection between the premises and the conclusion. How is it that that logic helps us understand these relationships? And of course, one reason to do that is, as I mentioned, that everyone uses arguments all the time, and everyone is reading arguments or engaging with people who are giving arguments all the time. But another reason to do so is that the textbooks and the papers and books that we're going to be looking at for this class are very heavy on arguments, right? Many of them are philosophical works, and in philosophical works, authors usually have strong views that they want to support. And the way to support those views is through argumentation, right? So philosophy is not unique in this, but in the sciences, even though you use arguments all the time, arguments are linked with experimentation and observation as well. In philosophy, even though you can have premises which are derived from observation, a lot of the discussion is takes place at the level of rational thought, rational persuasion. So arguments are like one of the main tools of philosophical persuasion and philosophical reasoning. So we are going to be looking at arguments in order that both you are able to understand the authors we are going to be discussing better, and also that when it comes time for you to write your own papers, you are able to formulate your arguments with ease, make them as explicit as possible, be able to give supporting reasons for the premises of your arguments, be able to show that if those premises were true, the conclusion will be true, etc., right? And which are all the sorts of stuff that usually goes along with arguments, right? So yeah, like this is just like a sort of crash course on logic, and I'm sure some of you have already seen this, but it never hurts to just go over some of that material again. And for those who haven't, you're free to email me if you have any questions on the material. We're going to meet this Friday, so we will go over questions and also some of the issues that come up in the readings that I gave you. Right now, I'm just going to focus on a couple of handouts I wrote, which are related to those readings. They basically summarize some of the main structures in argumentation. And I'm going to upload those to Moodle, those handouts. One of them is just on the structure of arguments, and the other one is on implicit premises. So let's look at the first one. Right, so an argument, as I mentioned, is just a series of statements where the statements, which are called premises, support another one, the conclusion. And by support, I just mean this, that the premises give evidence for the conclusion. If you believe the premises, then that gives you reason to believe the conclusion. That's just like the general form of support that arguments have. Of course, that level of support can vary a lot. So for example, you might have some arguments where the level of support is very strong and from premises to conclusion, and some others where it's weak. But all of the arguments, as I mentioned, when you see arguments in papers, textbooks, newspapers, you usually find them very informally laid out. But here we're going to focus on how to build and understand explicit arguments. So explicit arguments put all of the premises, they number all of the premises, and then they make the conclusion of the argument explicit, like this. So an argument can have any number of premises as long as it's a finite number. There are some mathematical logicians who work with arguments that have an infinite number of premises, but of course we're not going to be looking at anything like that. So just a finite number of premises. What else? Yeah, and those will support another statement, which is going to be the conclusion. So usually when you're looking at an argument and an author is trying to give the case for their view, they will usually give, in philosophy, arguments like this, where the premises are explicitly laid down and the view is then the conclusion that they're trying to support. Sometimes they will just write arguments down informally, in which case part of our task is to reconstruct those arguments in this form, the explicit premise conclusion form. Right, but then the most important types of arguments are deductive arguments. These are basically the arguments where the premises give the strongest support for the conclusion. In those arguments, basically the idea is there's an intent by the author of categorically demonstrating a conclusion. So if you accept the premises in a deductive argument, if the deductive argument is actually good, then you should also accept the conclusion, right? However, deductive arguments might fail. So they are either successful if the premises actually entail the conclusion, and unsuccessful if the premises do not entail the conclusion. But the level of support, the intent is for the level of support to be the highest possible. So deductively valid arguments are just going to be arguments that support the conclusion in the strongest possible sense. And yeah, as I mentioned, here are some of the reasons to study arguments. They are often involved very strongly in philosophy, but not only in philosophy, they are also involved in the sciences. And in mathematics, arguments actually play a very important role. So for example, mathematical proofs are simply deductive arguments, which are valid. But the subject matter of deductive arguments in mathematics is usually geometry or calculus or topological spaces, whatever. In the case of philosophy, arguments are usually presented in natural language. And obviously the aim is to try to support or undermine some philosophical view. So, but yeah, and there are going to be two key technical notions, the notion of validity and invalidity. So what's validity? Validity is simply the property an argument has whenever it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. So this is a property only of deductive arguments. Arguments that are not deductive, for example, probabilistic arguments cannot be said to be either valid or invalid. So, so whenever you're looking at a deductive argument, if the deductive argument is actually good, it's going to be a valid argument. If it's not good, that means if the premises do not support the conclusion in the strongest possible sense, then it's going to be an invalid argument, right? So, but validity, the technical definition of validity is this one that I explained here. A deductive argument is logically valid if and only if it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. What this means is basically that given the structure of the argument and the form of the argument, if the premises actually happen to be true for a valid argument, then it's not going to be possible for the conclusion of that argument to be false, right? So how are we going to determine that an argument is valid? Well, valid arguments actually have valid forms. That's what they are called, how it's written here, valid logical forms. Some of these are explained in the handout on arguments that is already on the Moodle. So a logically valid argument is one where if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true, as I mentioned. An argument where it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. So that means that valid arguments are going to be truth preserving. That means that if the premises are true, that truth is preserved in the conclusion as well. So I mentioned earlier that in arguments, the premises are supposed to give support for the conclusion. They are supposed to give evidence for the conclusion. And I mentioned that the relation between the relation of support between premises and conclusion could vary depending on the type of argument. Well, for a deductively valid argument, as I mentioned, the support of the premises for the conclusion is the strongest there is. So just as in the definition, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. So whenever you want to present the strongest possible type of support for your conclusion, you should try to provide a valid argument. One way to do so is to just look at the valid argument forms, which are, some of them are these, the ones that are in the handout on arguments. So what you try to do, these P's and Q's here, they are variables, but they are variables for, instead of being variables for numbers, they are variables for sentences or statements. So P could be some statement like, for example, if P then Q, if the cat is sleeping, then the cat isn't awake. The cat isn't awake could be Q, the cat is sleeping could be P. So if the cat is sleeping, then the cat isn't awake. That's premise one. Premise two, the cat is sleeping because P, it has the same value in both. Therefore, the cat isn't awake, which is Q. So that's a typical argument form, modus ponens. You just substitute statements for P and Q. And as long as as the substitution is consistent, so for example, you always substitute the same statement for P here and here, and the same statement for Q here and here. And as long as that is consistent, if the argument form is valid, like this one, modus ponens is a valid form, then if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Okay. Same for hypothetical syllogism. Premises are of the form if P then Q, if Q then R, and the conclusion is of the form therefore if P then R. So the same rules apply. You substitute the letters in a consistent manner. So always the same statement for the P's, always the same statement for the Q's and for the R's. This is a valid form. This is hypothetical because we're not asserting that neither of these is true. All that we're not asserting that neither P is true, nor Q is true, nor R is true. All we are saying is that these relationships hold, right? So all we are saying is that if P then Q is true, and if Q then R is true, it is going to follow that if P then R. So for example, let me give you an example. If I have to teach, then I don't have spare time. If I don't have spare time, then I can't read poetry. Therefore, if I have to teach, I can't read poetry, right? That will be an example. For example, P will be here if Moises has to teach. Q will be here, then Moises doesn't have spare time. R will be here, Moises can't read poetry. So what this is saying is if Moises has to teach, then Moises doesn't have spare time. If Moises doesn't have spare time, then Moises can't read poetry. Therefore, if Moises has to teach, then Moises can't read poetry. So What the conclusion does is, in a sense, it just deduces a property of the relationship between the premises. So the premises are just these things. If and then statements with if and then, they are just called conditionals. So these things just tell you that if something happens, then this other thing is going to happen. And then you have like a chain of conditions, right? So if this happens, then that happens. And if that happens, then this other thing happens. So if the original thing happens, then that other thing happens, right? And modus tollens is basically very similar to modus ponens. We have as a first premise also a conditional, if P then Q. So that, as I mentioned, that's saying if this happens, then that other thing will happen. So where P and again, P and Q are going to be statements, which you have to substitute in a uniform manner in order to create a logically valid argument. So if P then Q, then, for example, suppose it is something like, if Moises doesn't have spare time, then he can't go to the restaurant, for example, right? If Moises doesn't have spare time, then he can't go to the restaurant. It's not the case that Moises can't go to the restaurant. So you are denying the Q here. The first statement just said, if Moises doesn't have spare time, then he can go to the restaurant. And then you get some other information, premise 2, which says, well, actually Moises can go to the restaurant. It's not the case that he can't go, so therefore he can go to the restaurant, right? So if Moises actually, if it's not the case that he cannot go, then given that my first premise said that if I don't have it, if Moises doesn't have spare time, then he can go to the restaurant, then it must be true that that he has spare time. It must be true that it's not the case that he doesn't have spare time, so not P, right? So that's a little bit abstract here for those who maybe haven't looked at arguments and logical validity before. But don't worry, we're going to have like many opportunities to go over arguments and review this material. Here's another example, which is, I just want you to think for a moment. I want you to think for a moment about this example. Because the first thing to notice is that this example is actually has this form. If P then Q, a conditional. If the first thing happens, then the second thing happens. And the second premise, as I mentioned, just says that the first thing happens. Then given the relationship between the first thing happening and the second thing happening here, it's going to follow logically that the second thing happens, right? Where these are statements again. So what does this argument say? What's premise 1? Premise 1 says, if economic growth requires capitalism, then without capitalism, there will be no growth, right? So that's a substantive claim, but it's a conditional claim. P just means economic growth requires capitalism. That's the statement. That's what P means. Then Q, without capitalism, there will be no growth. And then that's premise 1. It's just saying that if this condition is satisfied, then this other condition is satisfied. And premise 2 is telling us that actually this condition here is satisfied. So so the conclusion is going to be, therefore, Q, without capitalism, there will be no growth, because what the premises 1 and 2 were telling us was that there was this relationship between P and Q, this conditional relation, and then the first condition happens. So the second condition must happen, right? How do we know this argument is valid? So that's a deep question, actually, right? So as I mentioned, logic is actually a branch of mathematics. It's called mathematical logic. Mathematicians study the nature of logical proof, and they try to create models of formal languages where they examine in what conditions the truth of the premises implies the truth of the conclusion. So one thing that we know from mathematical logic is that these forms are valid. So these forms will always preserve truth from premises to conclusion. But there are many other valid logical forms, in fact, an infinite number. But logicians, because logicians are humans and we are humans, we usually only learn a number of valid forms, just like the multiplication tables, and use them to formulate arguments in those forms to guarantee that they are deductively valid, and therefore that the conclusion follows logically from the premises. But here, for starters, we're just going to look at these three forms. We may look at at other forms at later points, but yeah, for the moment, it's just going to be these three. So, okay, so as I mentioned, then this example here, this is of the form modus ponens. So it's logically valid. That means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion of the argument is also going to be true. That's just unavoidable, given that the argument is logically valid. But suppose you want to object to this argument, right? Suppose that you don't think that that the conclusion is true. Suppose you say, I don't think that capitalism is necessary for growth. Maybe some people here, some people in this class think so. That's perfectly fine. But suppose you want to challenge the conclusion, right? Suppose you want to challenge 3. What are you going to do? I mean, the argument is logically valid. So the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion, given that relationship between premises and conclusion that exists when an argument is valid. So the strategy that you have to take in order to object to a valid argument is you have to deny one of the premises, right? So actually arguments have this property here. They can have it. They don't necessarily have it, but they can have this property here, right? So I mentioned that an argument was logically valid when, if and only if, it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. So if the premises are true, as I mentioned, that guarantees the conclusion. And I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself with that so much, but I think that the notion of validity is one of the most important notions that people studying even a little bit of logic and philosophy should really memorize. What does the logical validity of an argument means? That's a crucial definition. So it's very important that you try to memorize these two definitions, because I am always going to ask during your papers and whether arguments are valid or sound. Okay, so anyway, going back to the handout, an argument is going to be sound when it's valid. So number one, you must check first that it's valid. How are you going to do that? Well, again, you check if the argument is either one of modus ponens, hypothetical syllogism, or modus tollens. And at some other point, we're going to be looking at other logical forms. So we are going to check first if the argument fits one of these patterns of inference. Then that's going to tell you if it's valid, right? Then if it's valid, then you know that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. And then the next question is, are the premises true? Well, if the premises are indeed true, then the definition of soundness tells us that if an argument is sound if and only if it is valid, first condition, and its premises are true. So it turns out that soundness is the best types of arguments. The best type of argument you can get is a sound argument, because whenever you have a sound argument, you know you have a true conclusion. That's just inescapable. So why is that? Because again, the definition says that arguments are sound if and only if they are valid. So they have a valid logical form, which guarantees that if the premises are true, the conclusion is true. But then we also know that if an argument is sound, its premises are true. That means that given its validity, the conclusion is going to be true. So soundness is the best you can do in terms of arguments. So when you want to object to a valid argument, the thing that you want to say is that the arguments which are valid If the conclusion is false, then the premises, one of the premises, at least one of the premises must be false. Objecting to valid arguments just means that you're going to say that the arguments are not sound. You're going to reject the soundness of the argument, right? So you don't need to reject all the premises. You don't need to show that all the premises are false. You only need to show that at least one of the premises is false. Okay. So as I say here, that doesn't mean that this is a valid argument by most opponents. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. That doesn't mean that the argument is sound, because from validity, soundness doesn't follow, right? So if an argument is sound, that means it's valid. But an argument can be valid without being sound, right? So if an argument is valid, that just means that if the premises are true, the conclusion will be true. But we don't yet know if the premises are true. So if you reject the conclusion of a valid argument, then given that it's valid, you must argue one of the premises is false. So, for example, you might argue in this case against 2. You might say it's false that economic growth requires capitalism. Maybe you have some counterexample to this. I mean, capitalism has been around in its current form for a couple of centuries. Societies before that had some measure of capitalism, but nothing like current capitalism, right? And so that might give us a reason to suspect number 2, because there was economic growth before that. And even in the Soviet Union, of course, there was economic growth for a long time. Didn't succeed in the end, but yeah, so one way to do it will be to go through history, right? And then try to have some historical evidence that rejects number 2. So maybe the friends of capitalism will want to argue back against you in that case. But just for the sake of argument, just if you're thinking of objecting to this argument, one way to start will be to object to premise number 2, right? And that will require some historical evidence. Or maybe you want to reject premise number 1. Premise number 1 just gives you that there's this condition, right? That it's true that if economic growth requires capitalism, then without capitalism, there will be no growth. But maybe you want to challenge this conditional claim in some way. But in a sense, premise number 1 is a sort of analytic sentence, a sentence where that means is that that if you accept that economic growth requires capitalism, it almost trivially follows that without capitalism there will be no growth. But maybe you want to challenge that that there's this relationship. Maybe you want to see if there are other ways to interpret this conditional claim. But what I want you to take from this is that first, when you have a valid argument, you should be when you see a valid argument that's supporting a view you don't like, then you should worry, because that means that that you cannot simply reject the conclusion while accepting the truth of the premises. You're going to have to reject the truth of the premises. But that's still possible because validity doesn't imply soundness. But now that you have to reject the truth of the premises, you're going to have to search for ways to do that. You're going to try to think of you're going to have to think of strategies for rejecting one of the premises. You only need to reject one. So you need to find the premise that's easier to challenge. And in this case, I think the premise that's easier to challenge is 2. It might require some historical research, but yeah. We're going to be looking at a bunch of arguments and trying to object to them or trying to defend them. So there will be many chances for you to exercise your powers in that respect. And I leave that short lecture here. I will go over material on implicit premises in a different lecture. See you on Friday.